Hello. So in this video, we're going to evaluate a indirect tax and whether an indirect tax is actually that effective. So first of all, we'll start off with the really good evaluation, and that really focuses on the price elasticity of demand, and this is key if you're going to achieve well when evaluating an indirect tax. So price elasticity of demand, often abbreviated to PED. So if talking about whether a indirect tax is going to be effective, you must refer to the price elasticity of demand, and you must include the appropriate diagrams. And it's best here just to use a supply and demand diagram with either a price elastic demand curve or a price inelastic demand curve to demonstrate whether a indirect tax would be effective or not. So let's first of all construct our diagram with a very inelastic demand curve, so down sloping demand curve. We've got a supply curve. We know that indirect tax would decrease supply because of the increased cost of production to a firm. We'll label our new market equilibrium PQ. Q1, we'll show that decrease in quantity, Q to Q1, P1, and we'll label our axes, price and quantity. Okay, so what we see here is we see a price inelastic demand curve. So a good maybe such as cigarettes, a demerit good, which is highly addictive. This may have a very price inelastic demand curve. Okay, so what we want to say here, if we want to say that with the reduction in supply S to S1 due to the increased cost of production, which I've just abbreviated to COP, we see a increase in price P to P1. However, we see a less than proportional decrease in quantity Q to Q1. Okay, and the evaluation, would not stop here. The evaluation would then go on to link back to, if this was an essay, how about the market failure therefore would not be corrected, because of the less than proportional decrease in quantity from Q to Q1 may therefore not prevent over production or prevent over consumption, because the reduction in quantity, because there's a less than proportional decrease in quantity Q to Q1, and that is when the price elasticity of demand is inelastic, so price elastic. Then you must also compare it to where the price elasticity of demand is price elastic. So again, construct another diagram, price, quantity. Let's draw a nice elastic demand curve. Nice. And again, make sure it is really elastic or really inelastic. Really to demonstrate the point that you're making, and let's just label our new P Q P1 increase in price, reduction in Q1. So really, if we want a indirect tax to be really effective, we want the price elasticity of demand to be elastic. We want it to be the product to be price elastic, because obviously, as we see here, with the reduction in supply from S to S1 due to the increased cost of production as a result of the indirect tax, there is an increase in price P to P1, but in this case, there's actually a more than proportional decrease in quantity Q to Q1. And that more than proportional decrease in quantity Q to Q1 would therefore hopefully lead to a market failure associated with either negative externalities in consumption or negative externalities in production being corrected, because the more than proportional decrease in quantity Q to Q1 should prevent overconsumption and also should prevent overproduction. Okay, so really key evaluation is the price elasticity of demand. Whether indirect tax is going to be effective or not depends on the price elasticity of demand. Okay. Whilst we're on this diagram, we may wish to consider the burden of the tax, and we can make some equity arguments with regards to this. Okay, so if we start first of all off if the price elasticity of demand is inelastic, so it's price inelastic, we see the vertical distance between the two supply curves obviously represents the size of the tax. Okay, so we can see at the new market equilibrium as a result of the tax, the vertical distance takes it down to approximately there, which I'm just gonna obviously this is my as you can see, my original price wasn't in the correct place, but if we just highlight this area blue, this is the area below the original market price, and then I'm just gonna draw some lines across this particular area. So the kind of hatched lines in the represent the burden on consumer, because obviously that is the chain difference in the market price. It was originally P, and the market price is now P1. But the size of the tax is actually is a little bit more than just the change in market price. It's that small solid blue area, which is the burden on the producer. And what we can quite clearly see here is if the price elasticity of demand is price inelastic, the burden falls mainly on the consumer. And obviously this can lead to inequity, or some may say this is unfair as a result, and may lead to increased rates of inequality. Burden on the consumer, and we can therefore argue that it is maybe inequitable with a larger burden on consumers, and therefore this may lead to increased rates of we may also see an increased rate of inequality. With regards to the if the price elasticity of demand was price elastic, we can see the vertical distance between the two supply curves demonstrates the size of the indirect tax. So again, I'll keep the same kind of annotation. So the dark blue area is the area representing the burden on the producer, and the hatched area is the burden on the consumer. And we can quite clearly see in the instance where the price elasticity of demand is price elastic, the burden falls mainly on the producer rather than the consumer. So obviously, again, we would argue that if the price elasticity of demand is price elastic, it's far more equitable. Just going back to the point we were making, the burden on the consumer inequitable with larger burden, increasing inequality when the product is price inelastic. Okay, kind of building on this point, an indirect tax is regressive, and again, is kind of relevant to the point we've just made about the burden being on consumer. The indirect tax is regressive. Larger proportion of income used to repay the tax, and this is particularly specific to low income earners. So low income earners really feel the regressive impacts of an indirect tax, with all indirect tax being regressive, because they are using a larger proportion of their income to pay the tax. Maybe not necessarily repay, but the idea that they would use to pay the tax. It's a larger proportion, and again, obviously that leads to this aspect of increased inequality, demonstrating an issue with the particular tax. The effectiveness of the tax, we could argue, depends on whether the tax revenue is ring-fenced, or you may come across a word hypothecated, but means the same thing as ring-fenced. And what we mean by ring-fenced or hypothecated is the idea that the tax revenue that's generated by the use of the tax is then put to good use. So, for example, if we imposed an indirect tax on fast food, one would like to think that if the tax revenue from that was ring-fenced, it could then be used with regard to information provision. So it could be some educational program that is implemented by the government, and that information provision should further contribute to tackling the market failure by reducing the demand for fast food and correcting the market failure. However, if that tax revenue is not ring-fenced, it would obviously make it harder and more challenging to provide the information that we just alluded to. So if the tax revenue is ring-fenced, it could be far more effective. You may also wish to consider the type of indirect tax. So it depends on the type of indirect tax. So, for example, you may come across the term Pigouvian. And a Pigouvian tax is equal to the external cost, and this would kind of be the ideal tax. Okay, a Pigouvian tax is an ideal tax and is equal to the external cost, and therefore this would remove the welfare. This would eliminate the welfare loss. Okay, so a Pigouvian tax would fully correct the market failure. Whereas a per unit tax, for example, so if you had a per unit tax, that per unit tax may not equal the external cost, and as a result, therefore, as the per unit tax may not equal the external cost, the welfare loss and the market failure would not be fully corrected. Welfare loss may still exist, and if that welfare loss still exists, then the market failure has not been fully corrected. Okay, so really just to recap here, the key points you want to make with regards to an indirect tax is, first of all, you want to talk about the price elasticity of demand and whether it's going to be indirect tax is going to be effective or not. Obviously, most effective if the price elasticity of demand of the product is price elastic. Not very effective if it's price inelastic. And again, remember, this evaluation that we've done here isn't necessarily ideal because we want to link the final bit in relation to the market failure that is being corrected. Obviously, we know that the indirect tax is regressive, and we know that therefore lower income earners use a larger proportion of income to pay the tax, and therefore that may lead to increases in inequality. Again, it's inequitable, particularly if it is price inelastic, with the burden of the tax being borne by the consumer. We want to consider about whether the tax revenue is ring-fenced, and whether that tax revenue can therefore, that's generated from the indirect tax, can be used to further support and correct the market failure. If it isn't the case that it's used, for example, on information provision to reduce the demand of a particular good, then it's going to be less likely or less effective in correcting the market failure and reducing the quantity and raising the particular price. And you may also wish to consider the type of tax, Pigouvian tax being the ideal tax, because it would eliminate the welfare loss because the tax is equal to the external cost, whereas a per unit tax may not equal the external cost and the welfare loss may still exist.